How y'all doing? I want to make this video kind of explain one of the earliest fantasy series I got into. It's not like classic stuff that I'm more into now, but you kind of say it's almost kid stuff there. It's the type of stuff you find at the end of the science fiction and fantasy stuff because it involves multiple authors. You will find it in the expanded universe section. And what it is if you go to a bookstore like Barnes and Noble and all that, and you try to, if you go, usually they're marked alphabetically. Look for Martin M's, look for Token and T's, that sort of thing. But there are some series, the one section at the end, past the Z's, usually involves stuff that is could be a big hit, and they're expanding on it, but it's based on a television series. A hit game, role-playing game, could be miniature games and so forth. Usually, I don't know if there's an official word for it. I'll call it expanded universe for the sake of this. And the one I got into often as a kid was Dragonlance. And, Dragonlance series of books brought about by originally TSR, which, it ties in with Dungeons and Dragons. The idea behind books like these, and there are other ones that they make, which is Forgotten Realms, Dark Sun, Ravenloft, some of these you may not see on bookshelves currently, but they were all tied in to TSR, later Wizards of the Coast, to publish books that tie into Dungeons and Dragons. Now, you may think, oh, must have been a hardcore player and gotten into these books on that. Strangely enough, no, I've rarely played. I'm into miniatures and such. I look through all these books all the time. I read these books off and on, but I hardly ever played. What got me into Dragonlance was this kind of thing. I'll link down below if I can find a video of this this type of game. It was Heroes of the Lance on the Commodore 64. My father had a Commodore 64 when we were all growing up, and he bought various games for it. A lot of them he was able to look at video game magazines and program into code himself and save all that data so we could play play the games that are already made. But there's store-bought games, and one of them was Heroes of the Lance for Commodore 64. Doesn't look that quite impressive, but one of the things I got into it is I noticed it was Dungeons and Dragons. It was one of those things I heard about, but I don't know much about it. It wasn't until I met a friend later on who told me how this all works, and I collected all the books from there. And with the Commodore 64, it had the little instruction booklet, but it had the background of the characters, and I love the artwork that they show for representing each character. I love the story behind each one. Then I realized they made novels of these. In Heroes of the Lance, that was one part of the adventure in the first book here. It's you involve your characters going through Zack Saroff. And the same characters you play in Heroes of the Lance are the ones you read about his books. And I thought, oh wow, I just had to get that. And I started collecting the books into that series, got really into it throughout my high school years. I didn't start reading this till after my freshman year of high school. I read the first 3 books in the summer. And I enjoyed it ever since. And to try and summarize what the Chronicles of the Dragonlance series is, the first 3 books, Dragons of Autumn, Twilight, Dragons of Winternight, Dragons of Spring Dawning, you had this, it starts off in the town of Solace, which is a whole town of nothing but tree houses, and there's a famous inn, a very large inn, on top of one of these large trees called the Inn of Last Home. Well, that's where the characters meet. And what it was supposed to be this reunion of companions from previous years. They've been on adventures together, about 8 people. And after their adventures, they said, let's just split off for a certain amount of time, and then we'll come back to meet here after a set amount of time and recall our adventures. Well, all but one didn't show up, but while they all gathered together, 2 other people showed up in the inn, 2 barbarians from the plains. One carried this blue crystal staff that's been sought after by the strange cult that's been taking over this area of the world. And it kind of gets them into danger, and that later progressed into them getting into this war. There's this huge dragon army come about. This army that's been taking over this continent has a secret weapon of dragons, which are thought to be myth. These are all evil dragons, and then they find out there are good dragons, and they find out why they're not showing up. And they also have to contact the famous Dragonlance, which is a magically enchanted lance that you have a foot soldier's lance, but you have ones you could mount on a dragon, and instead of a horse and a lance, you have a dragon and a lance. And it's magically enchanted to take out what is normally a tough opponent, that is a dragon. And without getting too much details, that's sort of just it. There's this thing about the gods, which is a major part of this, where the gods of this world supposedly left after this huge cataclysm. The gods got angry and they left the people behind, and threw a huge mountain of it. It threw off the entire world, at least the known world at the time. That was called Cataclysm. So people have been living without these gods for a while, and you had these strange cults come about and all that. The characters became famous in our right. You see these in used bookstores, underneath these symbols, or the 5th Age symbol, which I didn't like. It's this, this red one right here. I like the original one, like this style right here. But for years I've been reading this. I got into the Chronicles, and I got later into the sequel trilogy, the Legends, which acquires 2 of the characters from the previous one, Raceline and Carmon Majir, and they go through their adventures together. One of them trying to descend to godhood. The other one is and his brother trying to stop him. The original Heroes of the Lance, Tanis Half-Elven, who's a fighter, Stern Brightblade, a guy who's trying to enter the knighthood of Salamia, which had a bad reputation at this time. The 2 Plains of Barbarians, Riverwind and Goldmoon. Flint Fireforge, who's this dwarf. It's all centered together like a D&D game. You make your Dungeons & Dragons. You and a group of friends create these heroes, various races, various abilities, and you go around adventures. And this is what it's modeled off of. This is supposed to promote back to Dungeons & Dragons. And same with Forgotten Realms, same with Dark Sun, same with Ravenloft, all those other games that tie in with that. Eberron, which is later on, one of the later campaigns. So you find this stuff all the time. And I got into Dragonlance a lot, tried reading a few other things, but mostly it was Dragonlance throughout my high school years. And I haven't really done much, today, because one, they're not really publishing these books anymore. Dragonlance has sort of faded off throughout the years. They tried to expand it through other things. It came to I think to me the borderline port where I really liked it to where it went downhill from there came from this book, Dragons of Summer Flames, kind of like the 4th Chronicle per se. After that, the descendants of the Heroes of the Lance go on through this adventure. Basically, again, the gods are involved with this, and there was this god of gods, sort of a chaos god, who didn't like what the younger gods were doing to this world, so he's trying to destroy it. So, and through that, at the end, the gods, at the end of it, the gods leave, and now what's called the 5th Age, and that's when you start seeing this red label there. It's a reference to the 5th Age and all that. And they try to continue on from there with new adventures and stuff. And I think if I had to telescope this whole thing, it was a case of trying to run the same cosmic battle of the gods again and again and again through these major story arcs. And with a lot of books with stories on the side of that. It kind of got tiresome, because after the first couple of times like this in variations, why do that? Because the evil god Takesis tries to take over from tries to manifest herself as the ruler of Kryn, physically on this world, and she, they try to stop her from that. Legends, one of the characters is trying to defeat her, become God himself, and all this just to really kind of promote the idea of a campaign world where dragons are a huge part of this. The iconic images done by Jeff Easley of one of the knights on a dragon with a lance on it, and so I got into this in high school, and my attitude at the time was I had very limited interest. My paleontology I liked, and I like Green Fantasy, in particular this one. And I'll tell you, in the long run, this is not a very healthy state of mind. But I didn't want to read a lot of nonfiction. I wasn't heavily into things like World War II or anything like that. I just wanted to read this in various forms. I read a few other things, but I read this a lot. I wanted to read about the characters, their descendants, and all this stuff. But if you take a look, this is what I have here. I mean, of all these books, this is a small, very small sample of all the books published of this. And I don't think it's encouraged to read them all. I mean, unless you're a really hardcore fan, because not all books have to do with one another. And they're not all written by the same authors, so quality of writing may vary. They try to keep canon with each other, which is more like to say for things like Star Wars, which, thanks to Disney owning it, dropped the entire continuity entirely. So here you are, put all this time and effort trying to enjoy more what you already love, and that could be, now it's all practically destroyed. You can still read and enjoy it, but it's almost no point. And what kind of got me to slow down, almost to stop on reading books like these, was not quite Dragonlance itself, although it was kind of going downhill with the Fifth Age. I didn't like the stories that were coming out of it, didn't like the setup of it and everything. I scanned through I think it was called River of Souls trilogy or something like that, where supposedly a new god is coming about, but again, it's just Tikis again. Again, they're doing this whole thing again and again, and it sort of loses its appeal when you think about, how many times is a goddess is going to try and take over this world. Almost a point if you're a goddess. But if it's a paganist, but when it comes to pagan pantheons, they tend to have more human qualities than the ideal ones. So, but that's a whole other subject entirely. But I collected all these books and read them, and then I started reading some Forgotten Realms books. This is a whole nother world. You got Dragonlance, which is the world of Kryn, and again, this is tied back to Dungeons & Dragons, but Dungeons & Dragons like, well, you got this world, what you can play in this fantasy world called Forgotten Realms, and it has its famous characters too. Dritz Duerden, which I was reading his stories at the time. Science Fiction Book Club had hardbound books of that, the whole trilogies of them. I read through his first trilogy of his origins, then I read the Icewind Dale trilogy, and that's when I stopped. First of all, there was previous books I was reading from Ed Greenwood, who is the creator of Forgotten Realms, but for some reason I can't read his writing. I found him kind of boring. His Elemenster series. Great character, couldn't read the novels though. They just kind of go wherever. That's kind of a short run of that. But then I read the Icewind Dale, which is better run by R.A. Salvatore. And, and they were fine, but when I read the second or third book, I can't remember which, it was where there was a scene. See if this sounds familiar to you fantasy fans. There's a scene where there's underneath this great dwarven fortress under a mountain. One of the characters gets in a fight with a large beast that caused them all to escape, caused the previous people to get out of this mountain in the first place. He goes through some battle on top of this narrow bridge, and they fall down this huge cliff, and the beast dies, but the hero lives. Yeah, this sounds like Gandalf versus the Balrog in Lord of the Rings, but in this case it was a dwarven king trying to reclaim his birthright in this mountain by defeating the Shadow Dragon. I finished the trilogy, I'm like, I've already read Lord of the Rings, so I made the decision at this point that instead of continuing on with this, find somewhat of a stopping point. Maybe find a book or two that I might be interested in. I still have a few of those. Haven't gotten around to reading yet. A couple from Forgotten Realms, and about a trilogy from Dark Sun. But if I'm going to read this, if I'm going to read something that's going to knock off the original, why not just read the original? Why not just read Lord of the Rings, which I already had at that point? Why read basic barbaric fantasy when I can go get Robert Howard's original stories of Conan? So I started doing that, and I slowly, from high school, got into other authors, thanks to a great uncle of mine who helped guide me through some of the good stuff. Michael Moorcock of Elric of Melniboné. And I started collecting the Eternal Champion series. Some of you may have already noticed on one of my top shelves is all the Michael Moorcock collection from White Wolf series. It did 15 volumes, all hardcover. I got them all. And, and it had Elric, Hawkmoon, Corum, Irikos, members of the Von Beck family, Oswald Bastable, all those wonderful characters. I started reading Fritz Leiber, Fafhrd the Great Mauser sometime later, Carl E. Wagner's Kane series, which I did a video on, Jack Vance's Dying Earth, Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun, Elsbrey de Camp, a forgotten writer who should not be. I want to get to some of his works in the future. But I started, but through this, because of my love for fantasy of this, and bear in mind, I don't hate this now. I still love it. I just understand as an adult why everyone was into this, because, let's face it, it is practically a knockoff of, I would say, yeah, you could say it's a knockoff of Lord of the Rings. But remember, this is trying to mimic a game that derived from people who enjoyed reading all the other authors I read through. You know, a lot of people back in the 60s read Lord of the Rings. It was a huge hit back then, especially when it hit paperback. And so you have the people who love the fantasy genre, and then you got the Gary Gygax, who creates a game. Hey, you like Lord of the Rings? You like all the epic fantasy stuff? Here's a game you can play that. You know, set your own adventures. So it's not surprising through the setup of Dungeons & Dragons trying to mimic from those books that the books written after the worlds they created are not necessarily the high quality ones as the original stuff. They're more raw, I would call it. They're not bad, but they're, you know, but I wouldn't say the end all be all of fantasy, of the fantasy genre, or science fiction genre. You know, whatever thing you get into. That's the problem with the expanded universe books. They're trying to promote something that's already there in a previous medium, and you know, not all of it will be canon. Not all of it can be integrated through. You can make up stories that can be good stories, but they don't fit into what they went through. It's just something to try and get money out of your pocket, you know. So, yeah. So with me, with that attitude, just wanting to read a lot of this and very little of anything else. Later on, I sort of, you know, when I came to those books, I was like, you know, I might as well read the original stuff. It served as a stepping stone to expand, you know, further horizons. You know, since I like fantasy and it modeled stuff off medieval Europe, I collected a few history books from medieval Europe to ancient Greek and Rome, you know, up to that point in Renaissance. I still collect the paleontology side. I always loved my paleontology. But I have some books that are folklore. They even expanded to classic literature. Because one of the classic writers in the science fiction realm is the writer Harlan Ellison. Not a sci-fi writer, he, you know, strictly a writer, but he writes stuff in that field. And one of the stories they did, which isn't science fiction, mind you, is just it's called Prince Michigan and Hold the Relish. I found a video of him reciting the story on YouTube, and I have a copy of the Essential Ellison with that story in it. And he mentioned Prince Michigan of the Dostoevsky's novel The Idiot. Well, I liked the short story The Idiot, and they talked about it, so I I noticed in the bookstore, and I got it, and I read it one summer. And I loved it. So, everybody, when you're young and you find something you really, really like, just bear in mind that you may not have a full set of standards to compare everything by. So, you could get into something and you look at it as an adult, it really isn't as great as you thought. But it's enough to inspire you to advance further and enrich your life through other ways. So yeah, here I am, still with all the Dragonlance books I have left. I collected a few more, but there were some stories that... Yeah, this series had its ups and downs. There are some books that shouldn't have been written as full novels. You know, they made novels of events that take place in between the events of the first 3 books. Look how thick this is. It's over 1,000 pages. You know, this has little commentaries by the author, just mind you on this. And there was events that they talked about on the side, but they never told in detail. Well, in order to make more money off the fan base, you take those sections there and you make full-blown novels of it. They made a trilogy of this. I'm like, well, really? I just didn't want to do that. And that's one of the things that kind of made me sick, with just kind of, you know, trying to get me to buy more and more, just read more. And there comes a point where if fantasy or epic or any sort of epic gets too big, you don't need books describing every little detail, which is why I never got into the prequel books of Frank Herbert's Dune. But I could look back on this, and much as I still love all the characters I grew up with, a little bit of nostalgia, I will understand why many adults who are already fantasy readers before didn't get into this, because it's connected to the game. They wanted to read something that was from an author's original thoughts. You know, I had an uncle who wouldn't touch any of this stuff. You know, he may experiment once or twice, but for the most part, he avoided all this stuff. And as I said, well, you know, once you've read Lord of the Rings, there's no point in reading all this, unless you love that type of fantasy and all that. Because one of the things I look back is, yes, you have elves in this, but the elves are practically just very attractive humans with pointed ears, and they're snobby. They're not quite the same as like the Tuatha De Danann of Celtic myth, or even the very elves that they're derived from Tolkien. And the Kender, which is I always enjoyed the Kender, but everyone else, they just derived themselves from the hobbits. They're short people, but they made a few twists. They took out the hairy feet and toes and make them small, childlike people that have a bad case of kleptomania. They're they're kind of like people that say childlike throughout their entire lives. Funny, but let's face it derives from something previous. So I probably wouldn't instantly recommend Dragonlance to any new reader, because many of the books that are kind of hard to find, which sort of connects events in certain ways. A lot of them you don't even need to read. I mean, if I have to say anything, okay, stick to the Chronicles that started all. You got that grand adventure, and then you could go around to sequel, the Legends. And if you want to, you can go through the second generation, where you talk about the descendants, and then you could probably, up to that point, read Dragons of Summer Flame, and I would probably suggest end it there. That's not too much to read in comparison to all. Find a list of all the Dragonlance novels. It is quite extensive. But if you can get into something like this when you're young, and it doesn't even have to be an extended universe thing, just something that you really like in the genre. It could be Lord of the Rings. It could be C.L. Lewis's Narnia series. It could be Michael Moorcock. It could be all that. But don't stick to that as the end-all be-all of things. Use as stepping stones, and if you can listen to other authors and what other authors like, you can look for them yourselves. Like, George R. R. Martin, he's a huge fan of Jack Vance's Dying Earth, and there's only 4 books of that, so find that if you can. Fritz Leiber, Fafner Grey Mouser, classic one. I did a video on that. And then even from there, extend further, because Michael Moorcock once said that if you want to write science, you want to write fantasy, stop reading fantasy. Read everything but. I understand his point about that. So yeah, that's where I want to end up on this. This to show you this is one of the things I read a lot when I was younger. I'm not too much into this now, but I still enjoy it, and I still keep them on my shelves because for nostalgic purposes. And I have to agree. This shaped my taste in reading selection, for good or for ill. So, thank you very much for all listening to this rant, wherever it goes, and you all have a nice day.